Well, the first issue we want to talk about is the compatibility of divine foreknowledge and human freedom. If God knows everything in advance that will happen, if God knows every choice that you will ever make, then isn't everything fated to occur? For example, if God knows in advance that Peter will deny Christ 3 times before the cock crows, then isn't it necessary that Peter denies Christ 3 times before the cock crows? Given that God's knowledge is infallible, that God is never wrong, that prophecy cannot be mistaken. It's true. And given that God or Jesus has said, you will deny me 3 times, isn't it necessary that Peter deny Christ 3 times? How could he do anything else? And if he does it necessarily, then how does Peter do it freely? Isn't it incompatible with Peter's freedom? So, doesn't God's foreknowledge of the future annihilate human freedom? Well, in response to this problem, some Christians would agree with this. They would say that by virtue of foreknowing future acts of people, God in effect foreordains them. So on this view, which was held by people like Jonathan Edwards, for example, foreknowledge equals foreordination. Simply by knowing that something will happen, that thing is foreordained to happen, and therefore human freedom is effectively removed. On this basis, even the fall of man into sin was foreordained by God. It was necessary and predestined. Now this view, however, not only removes human freedom, but it also rests very uncomfortably with the idea that God is not the author of sin. God is not the author of evil, and yet on this view, it would seem that by foreknowing Adam's fall into sin, that God in effect foreordained it. That really sin is the result of not Adam's choice, but God's choice, which I think ought to make all of us feel somewhat uncomfortable with this view. Rather, I think a better response to this problem is to deny this equivalence, to say that foreknowledge does not equal foreordination. I think it's better to say that God knows in advance what choices people will freely make, and that the free decisions of human beings determine what foreknowledge God has of them, rather than the reverse. The foreknowledge doesn't determine the free decisions, rather the free decisions, in effect, determine the foreknowledge. And here we can distinguish between what we might call chronological priority and logical priority. Chronological priority would mean that one thing comes earlier in time than something else. And God's knowledge is chronologically prior to the event that he foreknows. But logically speaking, the event is prior to what God's foreknowledge. So God's foreknowledge is chronologically prior to the event, but the event is logically prior to the foreknowledge. In other words, the event doesn't happen because God foreknows it. God foreknows it because it will happen. You see, the event is logically prior to the foreknowledge. He foreknows it because it will happen, even though the knowledge is chronologically prior to the event that God foreknows. So, foreknowledge, on this view, would be sort of like foreshadowing of something. When you see the shadow of someone, say, coming around the corner, you see their shadow on the ground before you see the person. You know that person is about to come around the corner. But the shadow doesn't determine the person, right? It's the person who throws the shadow who determines the shadow. And foreknowledge is sort of like the shadow, the foreshadow of future events, as it were. By seeing this foreshadowing, you know the events that will happen. But the shadow doesn't determine what the reality is. It's the reality that determines the shadow. So if you think of God's foreknowledge as sort of the foreshadowing of things to come, I think you can see that just because God knows something will happen doesn't mean that therefore that foreknowledge in any way prejudices or removes the freedom of that event that will happen. In fact, if the events were to happen differently, then God's foreknowledge would have been different. One way to think about this is, again, to try to give you an illustration, is that God's foreknowledge is like an infallible barometer of the weather. Whatever the barometer says, because it's infallible, you know what the weather will be like. But the barometer doesn't determine the weather, right? The weather determines the barometer. And God's foreknowledge is like an infallible barometer of the future. It lets you know what the future is going to be, but it doesn't in any way constrain the future. The future can happen however free agents want it to happen. But you just can't escape this infallible barometer, God's foreknowledge, tracking whichever direction the future will take. So those who think that God's foreknowledge serves to remove human freedom, I think, are simply quite mistaken. They posit a constraint upon human choices, which is really quite unintelligible. Let me just give you an illustration. Suppose this is the timeline, and let's mark some event E here on the timeline for the sake of argument. And let's suppose God is back here in time, and by His knowledge, He foreknows that E will happen. And we'll let this dotted line represent God's knowledge. God knows that E will happen. Well, let's suppose that E here is a totally uncaused event. Maybe it's the decay of a radioactive isotope or something on the subatomic level. So it's an uncaused event. It's not causally determined. How does God's merely knowing about E in any way constrain E's happening? How can God simply knowing that E will occur make E occur as it was? If you were to erase the line and say, well, God doesn't have foreknowledge of the future, how has anything changed? How would E be affected if you erase God's foreknowledge of it? Well, it seems E would just occur quite the same. It wouldn't affect anything. So the presence of God's foreknowledge simply doesn't prejudice anything about whether E will occur or not. So it seems to me that those who think that foreknowledge is incompatible with freedom are simply quite mistaken about it. What we simply need to understand with respect to something foreknown by God, say E, is this. If E were not to occur, then God would not have known E. If E were not to occur, then God would not have foreknown E. And as long as that statement is true and E can occur or not occur, then God's foreknowledge simply doesn't prejudice anything with respect to E's occurrence.